Alright, so in this video I'm going to be briefly talking about my top 7 reasons why I think someone should learn Latin. So first of all, I think that Latin just has such a different grammar than English that understanding a little bit of Latin grammar or a lot of grammar, no matter how much you sort of dip your toes into Latin, you're going to have a better footing for learning your own language's grammar. Speaking, understanding your own language and other languages as a result, especially Romance languages, you're going to have a better footing for doing so if you've studied some Latin. So two, spoken Latin is not actually dead. You might be sort of surprised that it's very uncommon, but there are some places where Latin is spoken. So obviously, like ecclesiastical Latin is spoken intermittently throughout the Roman Catholic Church. There's actually several podcasts that speak Latin. So Legio 13th, you can find that on YouTube. There are several people who speak fluent Latin on YouTube, and there's also like several master's programs. One that I know of is University of Kentucky, and I know there's one at New York, as well as graduate programs that is completely in Latin. So yes, you can find conventions as well in those same sort of places where you're looking at a higher education program. Usually you can find people who speak fluent Latin. That being said, you probably shouldn't expect to be a fluent Latin speaker if you start learning a little bit of Latin, because there's about an estimated 100 fluent Latin speakers in the world. So probably don't start studying Latin with the goal to be fluent, unless you know someone who is. But at any rate, 3, I think Latin has definitely a lot of cognates and will help you understand your own language just with similar vocabulary. Just something off the top of my head, there's a word in Latin, edificio, and in English it means you get the word edifice out of it. So, I mean, it has the meaning, the context of building, and it doesn't actually change in English. Now, that being said, not a lot of people you speak to in English are going to be using the word edifice, but it gives you a different context and structure to your mind so that you can use different words and you can understand the root words of several different languages by understanding certain things in Latin, especially Romance languages. And a good part of English as well is influenced by Latin because of Middle French. You have quite a few words that are almost carbon copy of a Latin word and have been adapted over time. So you also have 4, you have Latin the communication style of Latin is a lot more fluid. It's quicker, it's more concise. You can use fewer words to get an idea across than, say, English or most Romance languages. It's pretty incredible. You can usually sort of have a longer sentence in English and accomplish a lot more with 6 words than you can English, which would be like 20 words a lot of times. So when you sort of go through and translate, you'll find that 2 or 3 words can mean 7 in English, which is really amazing. All right, so 5, I think Latin is a great starting point for languages generally, as it gives you a pretty broad overview of many languages, grammar, and an extremely comprehensive overview of all the patterns of Romantic languages. Right? There's developments past Latin, but they start with the same basic Latin structure. Too, if you're learning Greek, Latin is sort of like a simple version of Greek. So in a sense, if you know a little bit of Latin, you can oftentimes work your way through Greek. And in a sense, it's sort of like an easy and fun primer for Greek. I think Latin, so 6, I think Latin is a pretty great vehicle for learning about the rich culture of the Romans. And you can learn about a whole lot of things, but not just this, but you can learn about the Roman history, you can learn about Greek history. So, a lot of times people will talk about the best things to read, and I think some of the best things for history, you can read is like Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. You can read his Civil Wars. You can read Tacitus's Annals. You can read Livy's History of Rome. Um, Sort of all of Roman history gives a really fun way to implement what students learn, so that students learn a lot about Romans and the way they thought, the way they lived, but you start to learn a lot about their predecessors in culture and history. So the Etruscans, and before the Etruscans, the Greeks. And so you learn a lot about the world by what the Romans thought, who they emulated. For example, a lot of people like Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar were huge admirers of Alexander the Great. And so you see that when these people went and conquered foreign lands, they're trying to outdo someone that they thought to be their predecessor. And so by learning these sorts of things, you get more perspective and you can sort of navigate the present. And you get a little bit more insight than if you were to just read the same things in English. You can go back to the original text and you can read the notes and say, oh, I know what this means. I know what the Latin is telling me. And you can reference different things with more ease. You're not as, I would think, you're not as blind going into these sort of pursuits if you know Latin or you're studying Latin. I think too with Roman texts with Latin you get a higher access into myth. So Roman myth is extremely diverse and pretty complex, and it's really worth studying. I would recommend looking at Ovid's Metamorphoses first, and looking at Virgil and Apuleius at some point too. But I think like a lot of ancient writers used myth to support their arguments and things, but Ovid sort of explains myth and redefines myth on its own terms. And so you can sort of learn about myth on your own while you're studying Latin, which is a really, really interesting thing to do. I think myths written in Latin allow students just one more way to implement their skills in a fun, instructive, and potentially insightful way. I think myths of all sorts and kinds are stories that allow readers to understand the culture that told these stories, the people that found these stories to be interesting. Roman myth is a prototypical example of what myth can provide to readers modern day or in the future. Um, so seven, Latin literature is not limited to one time period. You've got approximately 2,500 years worth of writings in Latin. Um, Students can constantly sharpen their skills, and you really don't need to know every single thing you read in Latin, because each time you read, you should be approaching it sort of from the context of trying to learn a little bit more and understand the root word, and understand the different usage of a certain verb that a writer uses, or how a writer, like say Virgil, can shorten two words into one. And this is like a different capacity for language. I mean, English, you sort of get that in the slang, but it's not as common. Like even in modern poetry, you see this sort of like condensed, or you take a syllable off a word, but certain Roman authors, they completely mold words to accomplish something different that a lot of English speakers wouldn't otherwise have access to if they didn't study Latin. Latin, I just think, is incredibly interesting and worthwhile for people to learn a little bit and be refreshed and come back ready to learn, take a break, come back, learn more Latin. There's never a point where you can just stop learning Latin. As long as you're interested, you can always come back and offer a little bit more. There's forums online. You can look on Reddit. You can look on Discord. You can look at universities. You can look at the hundreds of textbooks that exist. You can look at ancient textbooks. There's reprinted textbooks today of Latin that's meant to teach Greeks. So there's so many resources for it, and it's not like if you get an older textbook, it's not going to teach you as well. It's the same thing, and you have to adapt it to your own life. It's sort of a pursuit which is worth learning Latin. It's so worthwhile that doing so on your own or with a group of people, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's such a rewarding process that I encourage anyone who has a little bit of time to do so. And yeah, I would be really grateful if you could do that on my channel. But at any rate, anywhere would be great. So thank you for watching, and so away.